branches to die in kind of a stair-step fashion. One here, one there, one here, one there. And it's not the whole side of the tree. Usually it's going to be all over the tree in most cases. But there's no treatment for this one at all. And usually what happens, people say, oh, I love this tree. I love it more than life itself. But by the time it loses about half its needles, they've changed their mind. The love affair is over, and they cut the tree down. So it's going to happen to blue spruce when they get probably 12 or older. We're seeing it in younger trees all the time because they're more stressed. So it's another thing is, now on your wish list, you're going to say, I don't want Austrian pines. I don't probably want Scotch pines because they have a lot of disease problems. I'm definitely going to avoid blue spruce and white spruce. So, and this is why. Somebody told me they wanted to put in a number of blue spruce around their home, and I explained this to them, and she said, I don't care, I won't treat them, I just love them so much, I just know they won't get it. Well, the problem is they will get it. So unless you're planning on bailing on the house and getting out before they get it, somebody's going to deal with this mess, and it's probably going to be with a chainsaw. So you can buy a tree with a death warrant tacked to the trunk. We know how this ends. I have a wonderful book for you to read on Custer's Last Stand. I bet you can't guess how it ends. So you kind of know what's going to happen if you have blue spruce, white spruce, some of these guys. So we also have pine and spruce insect problems a little bit. A big one right now is white pine weevil, all pines and all spruces, but very rarely Scotch pine. And it kills the leader of the tree and sometimes that first whorl, which is the sideward growing branches. So about the beginning of May, mommy weevil, and weevils can fly, flaps herself to the top of the tree and lays eggs right by the leader. And as the new leader is growing, the kitties hatch out. There's the kitties on the top. My gosh, are they unattractive. And they feed underneath the bark and they destroy the cambium layer. And then the leader dies about June, early June. But people usually don't notice it till about Christmas. They've been dead all that time. It starts out as dark green, then it gets light green, lighter green, light tan. Then they notice it, and it's already dead. The only thing that you can do for that is to spray the tree to prevent mommy from laying eggs, which means you got to be there like the middle of April or the beginning of April, because if you're not, mommy's going to be there. And the interesting thing is, there are plant indicators to give you an idea when mommy's out flying around. So if you have silver maple, they bloom, and they have a bloom that kind of looks like fringe hanging down, like a little tiny bit of fringe hanging down. If they're blooming, the mommies are flying, which means, uh-oh, you were too late. That's why it's good to do it early. So we can also get things that can cause leaking of pitch on trunks, because you can see some of the stuff that's leaking here. Sometimes you can, this is pine bark beetles or ips beetles that can cause this, but you can see that leaking of pitch on the bottom for a couple of reasons. Sometimes it's just drought. The trunk, the wood, everything is contracted, there's no moisture, we get a big rain, it comes back in, there's a crack in the bark, and it leaks out. So what you do is you follow your little dribble of white up, and if it's a crack, it's probably drought stress. If it's a hole, and what you're going to find if you have pine bark beetles or ips beetles, there's little holes in the trunk, the lower part of the trunk, probably from about your waist down, that are about the size of a pencil lead. Teeny weeny little guys. They're under there destroying that cambium layer. So if we peel the bark off, you can see what looks like the roadway map here to Chicago. There's stuff everywhere. They ate that cambium layer that was transporting the moisture up and the nutrients down. And I think I ran out of energy yet. That's the end of my presentation. And now Jeremy's going to come entertain you with one.
I'm a family tree doctor. I've been here since 1997. I went to MSU and been a certified arborist since I graduated, which means I just had to take a pretty tough test with a multidisciplinary set of information. And fortunately, I passed all these years, so that's good. But this is a way to get a hold of me here. This my cell phone. Email is a good way, and if you have a handout, this is on there, obviously. But if you do Facebook, this is a really neat tool. And what I've been doing the last couple of seasons is when I'm out and about driving around, I see some really neat stuff, in my opinion. You might think it's gross. But what I see, and I think it's interesting, and I think it's relevant, I post it, and so every day I'll put pictures of things that I see. And I'll probably, I found some really cool things today that'll go up later. So, what's happening to your pine trees? Well, what's happening to your pine trees, and Gretchen has already alluded, there's been essentially a perfect storm of conditions to cause stress. And the perfect storm is basically disturbance, and you know, the gentleman in the back asked about shock. Well, there are various things that cause shock in plants, and construction is certainly one of them. The drought that we've had the last couple of years, the last really 6 or 7 years, we've had very wet springs, and then it's like the faucet gets shut off, and the temperature gets cranked up, and we don't have any relief until September for a long time, and that's very stressful for plants. And you can tell it's stressful for plants and trees. You start to see things like this. This is a dogwood, and dogwoods are a good indicator of drought stress because they just kind of like give up, and they go into what's called temporary wilting. They just kind of and usually the plant can go into temporary wilting, but if moisture is not reintroduced, then you start to get the brown edging, and that's called physiological scorch. And so you know, the other indicators of tree stress are, you have to look at the grass, the turf. And if the turf is brown, by golly, you know that your trees are stressed too. Because the turf is, like Gretchen said, is very efficient in stealing away moisture and nutrients from trees. So if the turf is stressed, you know that the tree is stressed too. So the other thing that is unique about Pine Creek is that the life stage of your pines here. You know, pine plantations were planted for various reasons. Paper pulp, Christmas tree farms, you know, to sell and things like that. But they're really not meant, they're really, what they are is a glorified crop that is meant for harvest. And when you don't harvest them, you start to get these things. You get overcrowding, you get moisture issues, you get you know, space. There's a lot of things that happen. Okay, so you know, my in-laws live on a pine plantation. The driveway is going through a pine plantation, and the guy who planted them is still alive. And he comes over and looks at them, and he goes up and he taps a few of them. He says, "I planted this here tree." He's a really great guy. The trees are very big, and to look at them, you think, oh, they must be 100 years old. They're only about 50 years old. But if the conditions are right, they'll grow. And the life stage of your trees, you've got, I guess you would say, geriatric for our area. Now, if you go up to like Grayling and you go to Hartwick Pines, those are great-great-granddaddy trees that are still standing. But in the landscape, the trees that you have are very old. And you don't see a lot of large old pine trees in the landscape. I mean, if you just drive around, you just don't see them. So this is a very unique situation. I love coming here because of the diversity, the pine trees and all the other landscaping plants that are put in here. It's very interesting to come here. So you've got all these different things coming together to create stressful situations. There's a shock, but then there's a general environmental stress going on. So if you think of a cup of water, and every time you get a major stress, you're squirting a certain amount of water in. Sooner or later, that cup is going to overflow. Now what happens is most insects and diseases in our area they'll attack all trees, but the ones that are healthy and growing vigorously are able to fight them off. The ones that are stressed, they don't fare as well. So what happens is you get trees that are drought stressed, it's really too hot for them, and so they become attractive to certain insects. And this is one that I see all the time, and I see it a lot here. And this is called black turpentine beetle. It's a conifer bark beetle. You know, you can attack a tree in many different areas. You know, if I go to choke somebody and I want to do damage, if I grab their ankle and I start doing this, they're just going to, you know, smack me around. But on a tree, the first 3 or 4 feet of the tree is critical. That's the area that basically all things flow through that area. You know, if you attack a certain branch, you know, way up here in the canopy, you're going to, you know, take out the branch, but it's not going to affect the entire tree. This insect affects the entire tree by the nature of where it attacks. And we see this a lot. So what you'll see is, this is not a quarter, this is a $half. You'll get these big popcorn-looking pitch masses, and they usually have a little hole. And so we already said stress trees are attacked. A lot of times, though, in drought situations, you never get this because there's not enough moisture for the tree to, and this is a defense mechanism by the tree, this pitch flow. If you cut a branch off of a pine or spruce or a fir, it will exude pitch. Why? Well, what it's doing is that it's attempting to trap and push out any organisms that may have entered in or attempted to enter in. And a lot of times what we'll see in here, and if we break this off, we'll see a little, it looks like pepper, orange to red to brown pepper. What that pepper really is the tunnels that the insects make. They eat and then they defecate. And then the pitch pushes it out. So the tree is essentially cleaning it out for the insect. And you'll see that. And so this is what you want to look for, these little things, these little pitch masses at the base. Now, if you're seeing this on your tree, it's probably a DOA if you call me at this point. And, you know, like I said, Gretchen said, sometimes you have like a little tag on the tree that's it's dead. So what you need to look for is one or two of these things. And if you see one or two, well, that's manageable. You see 50 or 60, that's going to be tough. Okay? Because what happens is you get a female that goes in, and she chews a little bit of a hole in there, and then she leaves. And then she comes back. She chews again. And what happens is you get the tree's defense mechanism taking over, and it exudes pitch. And then she comes back. She chews a hole. It exudes pitch. And what she's doing is she's exhausting the defenses of the tree and causing it to just basically die faster. You get a significantly drought-stressed tree. Okay. So the other thing that causes this, you know, you shouldn't prune certain trees at certain times of the year because it attracts insects, which could factor in diseases or piggyback on an insect. If you have a pine and it's not mulched, if there's no mulch around it, chances are you're going to have a lawnmower issue with that tree. And what happens is you try very hard to not whack the tree, but, you know, you say hi to your neighbor and you, boom, oh. And, you know, I mean, I've done it to my own too. And it's, you try not to. But what happens is when you open up a little nick or a hole here, this exudes chemicals which these insects can detect from a far off distance. They're very attuned to smelling the tree. I've actually been on crews where we've removed elms that have died from Dutch elm disease, and you know, we're handling logs, and I'm the ground man, and I'm, you know, handling the stuff and feeding the chipper and doing all this stuff, so I've got it all over me. And I'm sitting there and we're eating lunch outside, and I'm like, and I'm just, you know, what is that? And so finally I grabbed it and I looked, and it's an elm bark beetle. And it thinks I'm an elm because I've got the chemical signature of the elm. So you have to be very careful with mechanical damage. Okay, Gretchen already talked about Diplodia. Diplodia, you'll see a new candle growth here. It emerges and then dies, and it's not fully elongated. Here's a drive-through. You know, I'm getting ready to order lunch here, and I notice, oh, this is a good picture of Diplodia here. Right? And then here's another tree. This is an advanced situation. If you have Diplodia year after year after year, it will kill twigs and branches, and it can really devastate the tree. The management for this, it's tough. You have to spray chemicals, and you have to do cover sprays. And you have to start at the right time. If you're seeing this already, it's too late to start. You have to start. We usually think of tax day as a good starting point because the buds are starting to swell. And once the buds start to swell, they become resinous and exposed. And the spores are probably right on the bud from the last year. So once they kind of start to expand and water starts to make them get bigger and the membranes get a little thinner, then it can be infected. So you have to start early. So the first spray application is the most important, but then as long as it's in expansion phase, those needles don't have a real waxy covering yet, so they're more vulnerable. So we have to protect the needles until they harden off or produce this waxy cuticle layer. All right, and that usually means 3 to 4 spray applications of a protectant fungicide. There are fungicides that you can spray on trees that are curative, and there are some that are protectants. Protectant is basically spraying something on there for when the fungi attempt to grow on the tree. It creates an environment that's inhospitable to them. The curative actually moves in and destroys the fungus from the surface slightly inside the leaves or the needles. It's much better to do a protectant on most things, but it doesn't last forever. And so this is Diplodia, and this is actually my tree here. I planted Austrians, and I knew down the road that I was going to have a problem and I'd have to come home and do one more job before I went in and squeezed my kids. But they grow really well as juveniles. Like she said, the life stage of the trees. We see Diplodia starting to really attack trees when they're 15 to 20 years old. So that's the life stage. When they're younger, they're active, they're growing much faster, and they exhibit what's called juvenile resistance. When they get older, not so much. Right? So a lot of times you'll think, well, my tree's been fine for all these years. Well, your tree is now, maybe it's in the adolescent stage. It's 25 to 45 years old, and it's growing differently and allocating resources differently. Okay, Dothistroma on Austrian again. Seeing this a lot. I mean, any Austrian pine that you see, you can typically find this. And it's different from Diplodia in that it attacks the older needles. And if you're going to manage this disease, you're starting with Diplodia in the spring, in April, and that takes you to the end of June, typically. Well, if you've got Dothistroma, you've got to continue that spray cycle on into the summer. So it's very critical to know what's going on with your trees, because you can spray for Diplodia and manage it very well. But this is something that's going to affect later on in the season. I don't want to bore you guys with all the details. If you've got problems, give me a call. I'll be happy to talk to you and talk you through things. So it's very difficult to ascertain what's going on, because there are other needle blights. Lophodermium, this is a Scotch pine plantation. It affects, plantations are great, but if you put one person or one guy that's sick with a close proximity to a lot of other suitable host material, you can have a problem real fast. And as a matter of fact, when I went to Michigan State, we took field trips to Christmas tree farms, and we saw a lot of problems. So Christmas tree farms and nurseries and things, these are breeding grounds for problems, simply because you have a high population and a close proximity. So what we call that a high pressure. All right, so these are different diseases that will affect. This is mostly Scotch, and brown spot can affect other two needle, red, Scotch, and Austrian. All right, whoops. Okay, Rhizosphaera, we already talked about that. Here's an advanced case. This one's not going to respond well to protective treatment. Yes, sir?
Is that something you spray with a fungicide again?
Yep. Are you talking about this here?
This one, yeah.
Yeah. With Rhizosphaera, if you're going to manage for Rhizosphaera, you really have to start before you see Rhizosphaera, because it's much easier to protect your spruce trees than it is to try to come in after the fact. If you have a heavy infestation like this, it's not going to do real well with treatment. And matter of fact, I'll probably recommend not treating. Okay? But if you have relatively few needles affected, I'll say, okay, let's try. Let's give it a try. Now, the standard of care for Rhizosphaera from 20 years ago is different now than it is today. We used to say 2 applications, 2 to 3 weeks apart, and you have to get it right at the right time. And I'm really mad at the trees because they all decide to, be ready to be sprayed at the same time. And as soon as they're ready, when they come out of their buds, there's a bud cap. It's kind of like a little hat. And when you can walk up to the tree and go, and the bud cap falls off, a little papery brown thing, that's the perfect time to get your first application on. Yes,
Is that a spring, summer, or fall tree?
that's spring.
So if you get to the fall, you just wait till the
Fall, there's not a thing you can do in the fall for this.
Okay.
Okay. So you have, as soon as you get to the point where you have to spray, boom, you have to get it on right then. And again, you've got young needles that are very tender. They're very easily infected. The older needles are a little bit more hardened off, and they resist infection. Now, when we talk about cultural control, these are things that we can do something about. If you have a sprinkler system that blows into your spruce trees or pine trees, basically any tree, is not good for the tree. And, people say, well, it rains and it's overhead irrigation just like the sprinkler. Well, that's true. But it doesn't rain every day in Michigan. And it usually, there's a period of time in which it rains. And so if you're going to irrigate and you have to hit your trees, you have to do it at a time where you have maximum drying. And that's an issue to discuss with your irrigation person. But I see this all the time, where irrigation exasperates the disease. Because in order to have a disease, you have to have conditions. If a dry needle cannot be infected by Rhizosphaera, it has to be a wet needle. So, and then I read an article not too long ago that suggested trees that are nutrient stressed are more prone to getting Rhizosphaera. So that's interesting. So what do? You keep, well, I'll discuss that next. Other notable tree diseases, these are things that are worth discussing, even though they're maybe not specifically pine diseases. They are prevalent and important. And they're important because a lot of times they're either environmentally triggered or people triggered. So, stigmina and Swiss needlecast, we're seeing on blue spruces, we're seeing that more prevalently, and it looks like Rhizosphaera. But I think that Dennis is basically saying the treatment for Rhizosphaera and the treatment for the Swiss needlecast or the stigmina is essentially the same.
Pretty much. In stigmina, they really can't figure out how serious it is. So if you were looking for the black ping pong balls sticking out of the holes, if you saw stigmina, and I do on really infested trees that have got a lot of it, it looks like a black powder puff. It's kind of fuzzy instead of being like a ping pong ball. It looks like a black powder puff.
Right. So, and a lot of times you have these things in association. You have Rhizosphaera, you have stigmina, you have, all these other, it's a complex. And that's another thing. Phomopsis canker, Gretchen talked about Cypospora canker, which is very devastating to spruces. She talked about there's no control. And, there are products that, our suppliers will say, oh, you can inject a tree with this or that or the other thing, and, and Cypospora canker is on the label, so it works. I've been doing this for, a long time now, and it doesn't work for Cypospora canker. Basically, we're relegated to Civil War field, doctoring, and that is where we have to get out the hacksaw, and we have to remove the infection from the tree so it doesn't move in. Now, Phomopsis canker is something that's really popped up a lot, and we see this, and for a couple of years, we thought it was frost damage. Because the new growth would come out and then it would die, and you get this little hook, and it would look like, it's probably just frost damage. Well, you can't just take anything for granted anymore. You have to look and see, and you have to send samples to the lab, and you really have to stick your nose into the tree and look. And we've learned our lesson on that with things like emerald ash borer, where people have watched their ash trees die, and I would like to think that if I was an arborist in Metro Detroit, that I would have come up with, something a little different. Faster than, what went on. So, me personally, if I get a call, I'm taking it very seriously. And so, anyway, these are things that are, verticillium wilt. Verticillium wilt is a soil-borne fungi that can really do a number on things like Japanese maples. So if you have a Japanese maples got hammered this year. They got
frost damage,